Hello, my brothers and sisters in Christ. My name is Dominique Amara from Ordinary Doing Extraordinary Ministries. And today's video will be about a topic that many of us as Christians experience, and that is waiting on God. So waiting on God can be one of the most challenging experiences that we have to go through sometimes. And it may be challenging, but it is also rewarding. Waiting is not just some passive activity. This is something that we do expectantly. We're waiting on God to do something for us and to bring us into our purpose. So waiting on God is an active thing. It is an expectant posture. So it's about trusting that God is at work, even when we can't see it. Today, we're going to take a look at some people in the Bible and see how they went through their experiences of waiting and what we can learn from their experiences. Then we'll talk a little bit about ways that you can practically learn how to wait patiently on the Lord. So the first people we're going to talk about is Abraham and Sarah, and we see their stories in Genesis chapters 11 through 25. So God promised them a son. And they were very, very old. I mean, beyond childbearing age when God made this promise. So they had to wait even longer after already being old when God gave them the promise. They had to wait even longer. And that was difficult, and obviously they did wait, and they did have their son Isaac eventually, but there was some problems in between that time. And that was one of the problems, is that Sarah and Abraham tried to force God's hand into having this child. So they tried to force God's promise, but that was not what he told them to do. So Sarah, she gave her servant to Abraham as a wife, and she got pregnant, and she ended up having Ishmael. But Ishmael wasn't the promised son. That was not who God had promised Abraham and Sarah. Even though he did go on to make Ishmael a great nation, the promised son was Isaac. So we see where Sarah and Abraham tried to force this promise, and her trying to force the situation, that turned out to be a very big problem. We see today that there is still tension between Isaac's descendants and Ishmael's descendants. So that situation led to problems even to this day, and it was outside of God's will. He did not tell them to do that. So one thing that we can learn from that story is that ultimately it is good to trust God's timing, not our own timing, not our own understanding, even when it seems impossible. Even though they were old and it was like, there's no way, we are beyond childbearing age. Even though it seems impossible, God can still perform a miracle. We just have to trust in him, and we have to wait patiently and not lean on our own understanding and try to force God's hand. The next person I want to talk about is Joseph, and you can read his story in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. So Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, which is already pretty horrible. But then he was falsely imprisoned for something he did not do. And he had to wait patiently on God for deliverance. And God didn't deliver him like within 2 or 3 days. I mean, he waited years. We don't know how long exactly, but we know it was a while. Now, the Bible doesn't actually go into detail about how he was feeling, which I really wish that it did. But we know it wasn't all sunshine and happy days when he was in prison. But despite his dire circumstances and the things he was going through, he never lost faith in God. And in God's perfect timing, Joseph was elevated to a position of authority. And this was something that he had dreams about prior to him even being sold into slavery. He had dreams that his family and people would be bowing down to him. And that's ultimately what happened. So his story is a reminder that God can turn our situations around, and he can use them for something that we never even imagined. The next people I want to talk about are the Israelites. So they experienced very long seasons of waiting. We see their story throughout the entire Bible, but I want to specifically focus on the Old Testament, where we see how they waited for freedom for a very long time. They waited for freedom from slavery. Then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years after God had freed them from slavery. So even when they reached the promised land, they faced long periods of waiting. And a lot of times their waiting was a result of their disobedience. They didn't stay committed to the Lord. They groaned. They ended up worshiping other gods. They complained. They just extended their waiting and were punished for their sins. So they would go through these cycles of God freeing them, and then they start sinning and worshiping other gods, being involved with all these foreign nations. Then God will give them up to whatever it was that He would allow them to go through some difficult things. Then they cry out to God. He would save them, and then it would just go right back in a circle over and over. They would sin again. So it was just these long periods of waiting and punishment, waiting, punishment, and sin. It was just a lot. So they weren't very patient in their journey, but their journey was an importance to a testament to the importance of waiting and trusting and having obedience even when the path is hard. So it's important to be obedient so that we don't stay in a waiting period longer than we need to, dealing with the consequences of our actions. So the next person I want to talk about is Hannah, and we see her story in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 2. So it's a short part of 1 Samuel, but it's a very powerful story, and it's a story of deep longing and earnest prayer. So she tried for many years to have a child, but she was dealing with fertility issues, and during that she prayed fervently for a child, and God heard her prayers. He saw her anguish, and He blessed her with Samuel, whom she dedicated to the Lord. So Samuel was given to the prophet Eli, and he served in the tabernacle. And Samuel went on to become a great prophet of the Lord, and he was one of the judges of Israel. So her story encourages us to remain faithful in prayer, knowing that God hears and He answers in His own timing. We can't do anything to force it, but we can continue to pray and continue to believe that He's going to come through. David is the next person I want to talk about. His story is in the books of 1 Samuel all the way through 1 Chronicles. David was anointed as king while he was a young shepherd, and he had to wait many years before he was actually king. So during this time he faced numerous challenges, one of them being pursued by King Saul, who wanted to kill him. So during that time of testing, he could have easily just given up all hope, but David didn't. He continued to trust in God, and he wrote about his trust in God in various Psalms, one of them being Psalm 27, 37, Psalm 40. Those are just a few examples of where David talked about his trust and waiting in God. So even though his waiting season was long and it was difficult, he remained steadfast, and eventually his waiting season ended and he did become king. And the last person I want to talk about is Job. Job, his story is in the book of Job, and his story is one of extreme suffering and loss. So he lost everything he had, including his children, his livelihood, and eventually his health. But despite that, Job did not give up. He didn't give in to his feelings and the things that he was dealing with, and he didn't curse God, because in that tough situation, it would have been very easy for anybody to curse God, but Job didn't. Now, did he wait patiently? That's debatable. He definitely went through rough times, and he kind of was tiptoeing the line to completely losing it, but he didn't. God sustained him, and God restored everything that he had lost. Matter of fact, he got double of everything that he lost. So Job's endurance during his suffering is admirable, and it shows us how we must suffer and learn how to suffer well. And it's just a powerful reminder that God is with us even in our darkest times. Now, I'll be honest, waiting isn't easy. It's tempting to complain. It's tempting to be frustrated. It's tempting to give up all hope and just try and take matters into our own hands because we feel like God is taking too long. Sarah did that, and we saw the consequence. We still see the consequences of that to this day. But complaining, trying to force God, doesn't change the circumstances or make God act any faster. It just makes us miserable and makes us go into these patterns in this circle over and over, driving ourselves crazy. So instead, we are called to trust. We must trust that God's timing is perfect, that our timing isn't. We can't lean on our own understanding, even when it doesn't make sense to us. We have to trust, and we must trust that He's working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. So we trust that His plan for our lives is good, even if it feels like everything is falling apart. So here are some practical steps. How do we wait patiently? How do we practically do that? So 4 things. We do that through prayer, right? So we pour out our hearts to God, expressing our doubts. We express our fears. We just be vulnerable with Him, and we listen for His response. Sometimes He can respond to us through the Word of God, sometimes through other people, and sometimes He responds to us through that still small voice in our heads. And if He doesn't respond immediately, sometimes He will, sometimes He won't. But that shouldn't change anything. That shouldn't dictate how we feel or whether we keep praying or not. We just keep praying and asking God for an answer, asking God for breakthrough. The next thing is that we wait patiently through reading the scriptures. We find comfort in the stories of those who waited before us and how they waited. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I mean, some people waited patiently and some didn't. But we can still draw strength from those stories, and strength that God is going to be faithful in His promises to us. Then we wait patiently through obedience in God, or being obedience to God, doing whatever the next step is that He tells you to do. Yes, we have to do the thing, whatever it is, even if we don't agree with it, we still should be obedient to God. That simple act is an act of faith, and it is being obedient. You're telling God, I trust you despite what I'm seeing. And lastly, we learn to trust and wait patiently on God through surrender. So we release our grip on our plans, on our timelines, on our dreams and desires, and we trust that God knows what He's doing. Sometimes God calls us to do something that we didn't think we would do. He may take your dreams and turn them to something else. You may think you have it all figured out, but God has something totally different planned. So we have to surrender our desires and let Him tell us what we need to do. Let Him guide us, and He will do that. And there's nothing better than being inside of the will of God. If you go outside of it, that's when it's a mess. So learn how to be obedient to God and in His will. It may be painful, whatever it is He may be calling you to do. It may be something you want to do, or it may not. But there's nothing better than being in His will. So we must learn how to surrender. So remember, waiting on God is not a passive activity. It is an active, hopeful, and faithful anticipation of what God will do. So if you're in a season of waiting right now, I just want to encourage you that your waiting is not in vain. God sees you. He hears you. He knows all about you. He has a plan for you, and you just need to submit to it. Thank you so much, guys, for watching, and I pray that this message encouraged you. And if it has, please leave a comment, like, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and just continue to wait patiently on the Lord. He will come through for you.